into the 19th century when the social sciences were being born, anthropology and sociology and that, which said that in order for religion to be so ubiquitous and to perform more or less the same sorts of social functions all across the entire human species, there must be some sort of positive cultural service work being done here. And so it's from this school of thought that you get the idea that religion, although it didn't invent morality, morality is something human beings have been doing far longer than religion has been around. Religion is in some sense in the business of reinforcing morality or sort of enhancing morality in order to deal with fresh cultural problems like very large social groups as opposed to the very small extended families that would have characterized most of human history going back to prehistoric times. Anyway, the basic idea is that religion is a sophisticated social institution that relies on narrative and sacrifice and this sort of thing. Now, probably the truth isn't even so much, quote, in between. Rather, the grand unified theory of religion is going to use all the useful ideas from all of these cognitive science and cultural anthropology fields. So we're going to find out, for example, that religious narratives have to depend on our hyperactive agency detector, but it enhances them. In other words, it produces narratives that appeal to minds not just because they put a face on otherwise scary natural phenomenon, but then because you can use that face for all sorts of other interesting things. For example, you can persuade adults that there is a God, for example, that takes close interest in human affairs and is intensely concerned with how much sex people are having in the privacy of their own bedrooms. Only culture could do that, right? I mean, so we're talking about a very complicated cultural phenomenon, religion, that's going to have explanations from many, many disciplines. And we're only just starting to see a sort of general pattern to what that grand unified theory is going to have to look like.
To summarize and go through your sketchy outline there, one aspect that you could say is that belief in religious institutions or unseen agents is obviously something that's evolved in terms of neuroscientific functions in the brain, but on top of that, what gets attached to that and to a certain extent can get hijacked to that is cultural adaptation on top of that. So that's social institutions of God has this schema for you and everyone in society must believe in this, or it latches onto the universal innate feeling of morality and hijacks that as well. So there's natural evolution in terms of neuroscience. It's also further layered upon by cultural adaptation, evolution on top of that.
I think that's right, and I think you're going to need that sort of complicated explanation because, after all, religion, in some sense, is simultaneously ubiquitous across the species, but nevertheless, specific religious forms take incredible variety of specific narratives. In other words, what an indigenous religion 15,000 years ago in Siberia would have looked like is almost incomprehensibly different from what a Catholic theologian thinks God is today. So you've got to explain that difference. But nevertheless, in some sense, they're both religions. And I think the next 20 years will bring together this grand unified theory of religion. This is a very exciting time to be understanding how the brain does religion.
And as you rightly emphasize, how not just the brain does religion, but how historically and culturally this gets adapted and worked upon. Like you're saying, obviously the Catholic religious institutions across history is unrecognisable in comparison to ancient tribes that obviously postulated why their corn seeds would grow at a certain point in time. No longer to Catholic institutions that believe in this kind of social behaviour and have actually quite deliberately personified their God and his Son, well, I'm not going to get into the conceptualities of the Trinity here, as actually being a man like us. But yeah, as you say, it's a very, very complicated phenomenon, which hopefully more will come to light in the next 20 years. Now, my next question is probably going to be just as ambiguous in terms of a potential answer, but it's the same question I asked Dr. Andy Thompson, which was how we can culturally get rid of religious belief. It's obviously a very complicated process. It's not likely to evolve out of our natural cognitive schemas anytime soon, because the evolutionary process, especially with the mind, takes a lot of time. But there is a chance for culturally for religious belief to slowly begin to wear down, and we've seen that since the Enlightenment over the past few centuries, where that's begun to happen. In your opinion, is it even possible for culturally for human societies to shed dramatically belief in religious institutions, and if this is possible, how would this come about?
Well, it's clearly possible. There are highly secular societies in which only a minority of people are still superficially religious. We can look at the data. Certain Eastern European and Northern European countries, or Japan, for example. The majority of people, religion plays very little role at all in their lives, and of course that would have been inconceivable 300 years ago. So yes, culture can change dramatically, and no social scientist would be surprised at how fast culture can change. But we must understand the underlying causes for this. If you take a cognitivist approach to religion, the answer would seem something like, well, teach people how to read, then teach people about science, and that religion thing ought to promptly go away, like taking aspirin. Well, okay, that's probably not an adequate answer, but it's probably part of it. I think the ability of the human mind to have satisfactory scientific explanations for what otherwise would seem mysterious has done a great deal to relieve the need for anthropomorphic gods. On the other hand, researchers like my friend Greg Paul here in D.C., who publishes on the sociological underpinnings for religious belief, his research basically suggests that if you want to take advantage of the real correlations around the world, what you want people to be able to do is feel very secure in their lives and livelihoods. And then you will see a corresponding reduction in religious conviction and the power of religious institutions. Now, what he's getting at is we see a very strong correlation between societies that have abiding social inequalities and social insecurities, so that people resort to social institutions like religions instead of governments in order to obtain the psychological securities that people need. So what is really behind the way that certain countries now are extremely non-religious? Well, they also happen to be extremely secular. Secular in the sense that they have secular governments that enforce very reliably a rule of law. They tend to have quite high standards of living. They tend to guarantee certain kinds of financial and economic securities with robust social safety nets. They tend to restrain wealth inequalities. One of the mysteries has always been why the United States is an outlier. Lots of wealth, lots of science, high literacy rates, lots of education, yeah. But there's a lot of social insecurities here in America that you don't see in the other secular countries. For example, dramatic wealth inequalities that are getting worse. There's a lot of social insecurity because as large as our social safety nets are in the United States, they pale in comparison to European ones, for example. So a person losing a job can indeed be catastrophic here in a way that it can't be in Europe or Japan. Also, religion has found other ways to enhance social stresses. I mean, the Bush era is witness to this. How do you dramatically increase social insecurity? Well, you convince people, one, the government won't be there for them, two, that you're completely economically on your own, and three, terrible war is coming to your homeland. Oh, that was the Bush recipe. In other words, religion is catching on that you have to maintain a certain level of social insecurity in order for religious institutions to survive. And I explain, I would suggest that this is the root cause between this otherwise mysterious alliance between the economic and government neocons and the religious fundamentalists. In some sense, they need each other at this point.
In terms of social inequalities, it's not at all surprising that where there are social inequalities, that people are more likely to believe in some kind of religious institution just for the comfort that it brings in everyday situations, and obviously how one can survive in a society like that obviously doesn't bring you everyday pleasures, but you've obviously got the comfort of religious belief, and that's obviously to a certain extent why it's also been with us in terms of social evolution, because that's the kind of role religious belief can play. You would have been less likely to probably kill yourself if you had the comfort of religious belief in it. Obviously, to a certain extent, it would select for that. At the same time, more social equality. We now have a secular world, which is, of course, a constitution, rule of law, equality for all under the law. And that's one aspect where secularism can make people feel more equal under a society than previously it was under religious institutions.
Right.
Of course, and that was, to a certain extent, an argument of Marx, which is the most fundamental form of social equality, but obviously with practical problems. But the most fundamental form of social equality was void of any kind of superstitious belief. Now, there's been a lot of psychological research in terms of the more you feel in control of your life, the less likely you are to advocate.
Well, and that would be at an individual level,
Sure.
The sociological point that Greg Paul and others are trying to make. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, exactly. It's not too confusing. There's other psychological research in terms of patterns of data. So when people can make out correlations in a pattern of data, this is actually with like general specs on a screen, they can understand it and they can fully analyze it and then give you an explanation. But then if you can't see no correlation and the patterns just appear to be random, then you're more likely again to speculate that there could be something else that you don't see at work there, which is basically to a certain extent what you've been talking about in terms of the cognitive, behavioural and adaptive functions of religion. One question that I ask people that are well versed in atheist arguments, and someone like yourself who comes from a subtle position within analytic philosophy which deals very sophisticatedly in terms of what can qualify as a causation and what can qualify as an explanation in a first instance. But leaving that aside for the moment, but you could bring this in as an argument, out of all the arguments for the existence of a supernatural being, doesn't necessarily have to meddle with the affairs of mere mortals. It could be just a deist, but to a certain extent has to be causally responsible for being at least the prime mover. What is, if I were to ask you just one argument that you could present that you're the most confident about, that
Oh, me personally?
yeah, that demonstrates that there is no God for you? Because you've got many. You've got some from analytic philosophy, you've got some from the social sciences, and you think about it both theologically and in terms of the naturalistic scientific method. But if I were to go to you, John, give me one, just your pied de resistance argument for why there probably is no God, what would it be?
Well, you're asking this of me. I'm a sort of peculiar atheist. Peculiar just in the sense of perhaps statistically rarer. I was born an atheist, as many people are. In fact, indeed everyone was. And I just stayed an atheist. Religion never, for some reason, ever had the slightest temptation to me, even though my father was very religious and took me to church well into my teens. I liked the singing, but I could never quite figure out what the heck people were actually going on about this God or Jesus, and my father never tried to indoctrinate me, to his credit. My mother neither. So I've never had the experience of finding the existence of any sort of God the least bit intellectually compelling at all. In other words, I can't, lots of atheists became atheists because they did find God compelling intellectually or emotionally, and so when they sort of tore